out. While we await that rally and his remarks, we do want to bring in Neama Rahmani, the former federal prosecutor and president of West Coast Trial Lawyers. Neama, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So it's interesting because I feel like Section 3 of the 14th Amendment now being discussed an awful lot, but not very many people really understand this clause. So what exactly is this clause, and how did the previous courts decide to connect it to former President Trump?
Well, people are discussing it because it's an old Civil War era amendment that was intended to keep Confederates out of Congress. So it really hasn't been used in well over 100 years, and certainly hasn't been litigated. So constitutional scholars, lawyers like myself, are all nerding out about it because really we're talking about an issue of first impression, keeping a major party presidential candidate off the ballot.
Absolutely. And I'm curious because I think one of the major questions is when it comes to these sorts of decisions, why not just let the voters speak?
Well, that's a great public policy argument, and a lot of folks are saying that, setting aside the 14th Amendment, you're excluding a major party candidate, so a significant percentage of the American public are going to be upset. They're going to be disenfranchised, probably well over 100 million people. So is this an issue for the political arena, or is this something that should be decided by the courts? That's what people are grappling with right now. But on the legal side, Trump still has plenty of arguments why Section 3 doesn't apply to him.
Absolutely. And I'm also curious, if this does go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, this is a court, of course, with a predominantly conservative bench, including 3 justices appointed by Trump. Really, would this be a foregone conclusion, so to speak, that they would rule in his favor?
I think the Supreme Court has to take this case. That's what the justices are meant to do. We already talked about how it's a constitutional issue, really a first impression. But importantly, there's inconsistent rulings all over the country. You've had judges that have said that voters have no standing to bring these claims. You have others who have said that Trump needs to be charged or convicted of insurrection for the 14th Amendment disqualification to apply. Others who have said that really this is an issue for Congress, and that since Trump was acquitted in his impeachment trial before the Senate, the 14th Amendment doesn't apply. So the justices really need to sort through all this. And Trump has many paths to victory, and like you said, it's a pretty favorable makeup of the current court.
And of course, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, is the highest court in the land. And you were mentioning that lower courts have made a wide array of rulings. Once the Supreme Court makes their decision, that really sets the precedent. And if they vote in favor of Trump, I would have to imagine that sends a very strong signal, not just to the country, but also to the base.
I think it does. And, we're dealing with issues that really the Supreme Court needs to step in and handle. One is, of course, the executive or presidential immunity. That's being fast-tracked, and Special Counsel Jack Smith wants the court to rule on that. And, of course, now this 14th Amendment issue. Normally, these cases take years to end up in the Supreme Court, and if the justices even decide to consider them at all. But, Donald Trump is certainly one to litigate and one to really make new law. So we're going to see one way or the other whether these constitutional protections apply to the former president, or if the 14th Amendment challengers have a good case or not.
Now, the Colorado Supreme Court decision was very close by a vote of 4-3. Does that only further solidify and really signal that this really is going to go into Trump's favor?
I think so. All 7 justices in Colorado were appointed by Democratic governors. And, everyone always thought that the Colorado case had the best chance of success, and this is why. Under Colorado law, the Secretary of State has an affirmative duty to remove any candidates that don't qualify for constitutional reasons. That same affirmative duty doesn't exist in other states. So the fact that there was this duty and the liberal makeup of the justices gave these challengers the best chance. But like you said, there were 3 dissenting justices. One of them dissented because there was no charge of insurrection. One dissented because there was no conviction of insurrection. And then the third said it's really not something that's appropriate for the judges to decide at all. So if the liberals are this divided, I expect the conservatives to be pretty well unified and not wanting to keep Donald Trump off the ballot next year.
And speaking of liberals and conservatives, I do want to take our viewers and you back in time to specifically 2000 and 2016. You know, the Democrats kind of were on the other side of this, talking about a broken system. Hillary Clinton, of course, received more popular votes than Trump, but less electoral votes. And then in 2000, Al Gore received more popular votes, but less electoral votes than Bush. So, you know, is there a bit of hypocrisy going on?
Well, a lot of folks have been critical of the Electoral College because, you know, it really, the presidential race comes down just to a small handful of swing states. It may even suppress the vote. You know, obviously, this is something that is written into our Constitution. So lawyers like myself, unless there's some constitutional amendment, we intend to follow the law. But I do understand why some folks are critical because really their vote doesn't matter in a winner-take-all Electoral College system, again, unless you're in one of those key swing states.
So, in a larger perspective, when we're talking about all of this, we've seen the history, we've seen the decision making. Is this all just political theatrics?
No, it may be, and really the question is, I'm a former prosecutor, so the question is, if, you know, Jack Smith or any other federal prosecutor doesn't think there's enough evidence to charge Trump with insurrection and convict him beyond a reasonable doubt, you know, is that enough? What we have, what the January 6th committee did, you know, because ultimately there has to be some sort of finding of fact, and having a Colorado district judge, which is the lowest level court there, make this finding as such one of such monumental significance. Is that enough? Did Donald Trump receive all the procedural and due process safeguards that any other criminal defendant would have? Obviously, again, this is not a criminal case, but I think that's the challenge that a lot of lawyers like myself have. Look, if you want to keep him off the ballot, prosecute him for insurrection, convict him, and then he'll be disqualified. But something short of that may be something that folks just really aren't comfortable with.
And this really is historic in nature. Can you talk about, in the context, you know, how significant all of this really is and what it means?
Oh, I mean, it's very significant. If, in the unlikely chance that these challengers can keep Donald Trump off the ballot, especially Joe Biden's going to win Colorado. I mean, that's just a foregone conclusion. But in a swing state, let's say they were successful in Michigan, for instance, where one of the challenges were, I mean, that can absolutely determine who's going to be president next year. I mean, we're talking about something that's very huge. Now, the question is, and it goes back to that constitutional question, is the 14th Amendment, Section 3, is it self-executing? So when you see, you know, law professors talk about that, is it something that requires a conviction and impeachment, something more, or is it something that a judge can rule, well, you violated Section 3, so I'm going to keep you off the ballot? And that's the big question that we're dealing with.
And we'll have to see. I mean, Trump's attorneys vowing to take this all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Of course, we're going to have to watch until this plays out. At this point in time, we are still waiting for that rally to happen. We're going to take a quick break, but before we go to break, Neama, is there anything else that you would want to share with us?
I think this is something that it's going to be fast-tracked on appeal, and you know, it's really unique. We saw this obviously with Nixon and Watergate, where the Supreme Court acted very quickly, but typically they don't take these types of cases sometimes for years. There's briefing and there's amicus briefs, which are fronted to the court. So we're going to see 2 fast-track cases potentially. Both this one, I think the Colorado case absolutely has to end up before the court this term, and then of course the presidential or executive immunity case. So, you know, we're going to see those justices working overtime and handling cases much faster than they typically would.
And then just quickly, because it's interesting, obviously there's the deadline of January 5th for Colorado to print its presidential primary ballots. But just so we understand from the legal perspective, if Trump's attorneys appeal this decision to the U.S. Supreme Court, once they appeal, will his name still be allowed to appear on the ballot even if the justices have not yet taken on this case?
Not necessarily. The Supreme Court needs to act, and that's a court of discretion. They don't have to take every appeal. And of course, I fully expect them to accept this case because it's so incredibly important. But there is a possibility, albeit unlikely, that the court says, we're not going to take this case, in which case the Colorado Supreme Court decision stands. Now, assuming they do take the case, and usually it takes 4 of the 9 justices to agree to do so, what they'll probably do is issue a stay, which means they'll put the Colorado Supreme Court decision on hold until the briefing and oral argument and ultimately a decision happens in the U.S. Supreme Court.
So interesting. I mean, truly history in the making as we're watching this all unfold. Neama, I would rather say, Rahmani, we really appreciate your insight, your perspective, and your context in all of this.